Imagine a killer so cunning that their every move is a puzzle, their every victim a clue to something far darker than murder. An FBI agent is racing against time, and against the chilling spiral of the Cipher Killer's deadly codes. But what if the key to unlocking the truth lies not in the evidence, but in FBI agent's own bloodline? This isn't just a battle for justice. It's a descent into the abyss of ancient horrors. Welcome to the Cipher Killer's game. The clock is ticking. If you love horror stories like this, where every shadow hides a secret and every twist leaves you breathless, please consider subscribing. We release new horror stories every week. Chapter 1. The Cipher Killer's latest victim. The air in the conference room was thick with tension. FBI Agent Lee Harker sat at the table, the weight of the case files pressing down on him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, cold glow. Harker rubbed his tired eyes, the image of the latest victim seared into his mind. The victim, a young woman, lay on a steel table in the morgue. The Cipher Killer's signature, letters and numbers carved into her skin. Each victim, each code, a piece of a puzzle Harker couldn't solve. The press was having a field day, the public clamoring for answers. Harker felt the weight of expectation, the burden of bringing a killer to justice. He was determined to catch the Cipher Killer, but a part of him was afraid of what he might find. Harker had spent countless hours poring over the codes, trying to find a connection, a key to unlock the killer's twisted logic. Cryptologists from Quantico had been brought in, but even their expertise had failed to crack the code. The numbers and letters seemed random, yet Harker couldn't shake the feeling that they held a deeper significance. Like a melody with a missing note, the codes taunted him, their meaning just out of reach. He had spent nights staring at the codes, willing them to reveal their secrets. He had tried every combination, every possible interpretation, but the meaning remained elusive. The frustration was starting to gnaw at him, making him doubt his instincts. Was there even a pattern to find? Or was he chasing shadows, letting the killer's mind games get the better of him? He remembered the words of his mentor, a grizzled veteran of the Bureau, who had once told him, sometimes, the hardest thing to see is what's right in front of you. Harker had dismissed it as a platitude at the time, but now, as he stared at the seemingly random sequence of letters and numbers, the words came back to him with a chilling resonance. What was he missing? What was the Cipher Killer trying to tell him? Harker picked up a red marker and began to connect the dots on a map of the city. Each dot represented a victim, each location marked by the chilling precision of the Cipher Killer's code. As he connected the dots, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that made his blood run cold. The killings weren't random. They formed a spiral, a tightening gyre, and Harker had a sinking feeling that he was standing at its center. The flickering blue and red lights of the patrol cars painted the suburban street in an eerie glow. Harker stepped out of his car, the crisp night air doing little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. The victim's house, a modest brick bungalow, was cordoned off with yellow tape. Harker showed his badge to the officer guarding the entrance and stepped into the house. The air inside was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the cloying aroma of incense. Harker's gut clenched. This was no ordinary murder scene. The young woman, the latest victim of the Cipher Killer, lay in the center of the room, her body carefully positioned in a macabre tableau. Her limbs were splayed outwards, forming a crude star shape. Candles surrounded her body, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. Harker had seen his fair share of gruesome crime scenes, but the sheer theatricality of this one sent shivers down his spine. The code, H3, 7, 14, 5, was etched into her skin. Symbols, ancient and arcane, were scrawled on the walls in what appeared to be blood. Harker recognized them from a past case involving a cult and felt a deep unease settle in his gut. Chapter 2, Symbols of a Darker Power. Harker took a deep breath, trying to quell the unease and horror that threatened to engulf him. He had always been a man of logic, but this case, with its cryptic clues and ritualistic horror overtones, was pushing him to the edge. He knew these symbols were more than mere decorations. They were clues to a dark and dangerous truth. Who was this Cipher Killer? What was his motive? He had seen similar symbols before during his investigation of a cult in the city's underbelly. The memory resurfaced with unsettling clarity. The chanting, the blood, the fanaticism. Harker finished photographing the symbols and stood, his gaze sweeping over the room once more. He had a feeling this case was about more than just catching a killer. It was about confronting something ancient and evil. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. Professor Miriam Crane was an expert in the occult, a scholar of ancient languages and forgotten lore. The professor's voice, when she answered the phone, was a welcome sound in the midst of the macabre scene. She sounded older, her voice tinged with a weariness that Harker hadn't remembered, but her mind was still sharp, her intellect undimmed. He wasted no time with pleasantries, his words tumbling out in a rush as he described the crime scene, the symbols, the chilling precision of the killer's work. He could hear her drawing a sharp breath on the other end of the line, a sound that spoke volumes.
These are not mere symbols, Agent Harker. They are sigils, ancient and powerful. They speak of a darkness that most people would refuse to believe exists.
Harker listened intently, his gut clenching at her words. He had always been a pragmatist, a man of science and logic, but the evidence before him, the sheer wrongness of the scene, was forcing him to confront the possibility that there were forces at work in this world that defied rational explanation. "What do they mean, Professor?" Harker asked, his voice barely a whisper. He needed to understand, needed to make sense of the chaos that swirled around him. He needed something to hold on to, something to anchor him in the face of the abyss that seemed to be opening up before him. The professor was silent for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully.
These sigils, Agent Harker, they are not meant to be understood, not in the traditional sense. They are keys, you see. Keys that can unlock doors to realms beyond our comprehension. They are invitations.
Harker felt a shiver run down his spine, a primal fear gripping his heart. Invitations? To what? What horrors lurked behind these symbols waiting to be unleashed? Chapter 3, Invitations from the Abyss. Invitations to what, Professor? Harker asked, his voice tight with apprehension. The air in the room seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of dread that sent goosebumps erupting on his arms. He felt a strange mix of fascination and fear, his rational mind struggling to reconcile with the unsettling truths the professor was revealing. There was a long pause, the silence broken only by the faint crackling of the phone line. When Professor Crane spoke again, her voice was barely audible, laden with a chilling gravity.
They are invitations, Agent Harker, to open a door to something not of this world.
Harker closed his eyes, drawing a deep, steadying breath. The professor's words hit him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last vestiges of his skepticism. He had spent his career chasing shadows, hunting monsters in human form, but this was something different, something ancient and evil, something that whispered of realms beyond human comprehension. He could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its immensity. He had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to face down fear with logic and deduction, but this case, this descent into the heart of darkness, was testing the very limits of his sanity. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was standing on the precipice of a nightmare, and there was no turning back. The oppressive weight of the case settled onto Harker's shoulders like a shroud. Days blurred into nights, the cryptic symbols and the chilling pronouncements of Professor Crane echoing in his mind. Sleep offered no respite, his dreams invaded by fleeting images, whispers from the past he couldn't quite grasp. Harker felt a surge of anger, a burning need to bring their killer to justice, but it was an anger tinged with a growing sense of dread. One night, amidst the chaos of his investigation, a particularly vivid dream jolted Harker awake. Chapter 4, The Coordinates of Fear. The dream, though unsettling, held a strange allure, a sense of familiarity that tugged at the edges of Harker's memory. He returned to the codes, his mind working overtime, searching for any possible connection, any lead that might break the case wide open. Then, like a bolt from the blue, it hit him. The codes weren't letters and numbers, they were coordinates. The location that flashed on the screen was not a warehouse or an office building, but a place he knew better than his own reflection, a place he had sworn he would never return to, his family's abandoned farmhouse. A wave of nausea washed over Harker as he stared at the coordinates on the map, the farmhouse at the center of the spiral like a spider waiting at the heart of its web. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not ignore the connection any longer. He had to return to the farmhouse to confront the ghosts of his past and face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As he drove through the night, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness, Harker couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He knew that what he was about to face would test him in ways he could never have imagined, but he had come too far to turn back now. The farmhouse loomed out of the darkness, its silhouette a jagged scar against the horizon. He drew his weapon, his hand steady despite the tremor that ran through him, and pushed open the front door. Harker moved cautiously through the house, his senses on high alert, his hand never straying far from his weapon. He made his way to his father's study, the room where he had spent countless hours poring over ancient texts and arcane symbols. His father hadn't just been a scholar of the occult, he had been a practitioner, a man who had delved into the darkest corners of forbidden knowledge, a man who had sought to unlock the secrets of life and death. The journal slipped from Harker's grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the silent house. He rose from the desk, his legs feeling weak and unsteady, and made his way over to a heavy wooden trunk tucked away in the corner of the room. He knelt down beside the trunk, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings on its surface. He could feel a strange energy emanating from the trunk, a palpable sense of wrongness that sent shivers down his spine. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever lay inside held the key to unlocking the mystery of the Cipher Killer. The lock, rusted with age, finally gave way with a groan, and the lid of the trunk creaked open, releasing a musty odor that sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. The trunk's interior was a jumble of objects, each one seemingly imbued with a strange energy that set Harker's teeth on edge. His gaze fell upon a collection of photographs, their edges yellowed with age, tucked away in a corner of the trunk. As his eyes fell upon the images, a gasp escaped his lips, and he staggered back as if struck. The faces staring up at him from the photographs were not strangers. They were the victims of the Cipher Killer, their eyes vacant and lifeless, their expressions frozen in masks of terror. The realization hit Harker like a physical blow, the truth of his father's legacy slamming into him with the force of a runaway train. His father hadn't just been researching the occult, he had been actively involved in something dark and sinister, something that had claimed the lives of countless innocent people. Chapter 5: The Bloodline Must Endure. Harker's hands trembled as he turned the pages of the diary, each entry more disturbing than the last. There were diagrams of summoning circles and sigils, accompanied by detailed descriptions of the rituals needed to open a gateway to another realm, a realm inhabited by beings of immense power and unimaginable cruelty. He read of his father's belief that he was the descendant of an ancient bloodline, a bloodline chosen to serve as a conduit between the mortal world and the realm beyond. The date on the page sent a chill down his spine. It was the day his father had disappeared, the day he had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a legacy of fear. "The time is near," the entry began, the words seeming to burn themselves into Harker's mind. "Lee is the vessel. The bloodline must endure." A cold wind seemed to sweep through the study, extinguishing the lamp on the desk and plunging Harker into darkness. He dropped the diary, the pages scattering across the floor, his heart pounding in his chest. The basement door, which had been closed when he entered the study, now stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him from below. He could hear a faint scratching sound coming from the basement stairs, like claws scraping against wood. A figure began to emerge from the darkness, its form indistinct in the shadows, but its eyes glowed with an eerie light, a light that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. It was his father, or at least a grotesque parody of the man he once knew.
"You've grown, Lee, but you're still my son, my heir."
He took a step closer, his shadow stretching out across the floor towards Harker, and a chilling smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that had become unnaturally pointed, like those of a predator.
"I am what your destiny holds, Lee. I'm the culmination of generations of knowledge, of power. And you, my son, are the key to unlocking it all."
Harker shook his head, his mind rebelling against the horror unfolding before him. His father was gone, consumed by the very forces he had sought to control, and now, those forces were coming for him.
"You were meant to finish what I started, Lee. The bloodline must endure. You are the vessel."
Harker's finger tightened on the trigger, his mind reeling from the impossible truth. His father, twisted and corrupted, stood before him, a specter from his nightmares.
"Stay back!"
Harker shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. His father chuckled, a dry, rattling sound.
"Don't be foolish, Lee. You can't escape your destiny."
He gestured towards the open trunk, eyes burning with an unholy light.
"Embrace it, and we will rule together."
Harker knew his father wasn't bluffing. The air crackled with unseen energy. He had to find a way to fight back. Harker's father tilted his head, a grotesque parody of curiosity twisting his skeletal features.
"What are you babbling about, Lee?"
he asked, his voice laced with amusement.
"Do you think you can defeat me with words? I am beyond your comprehension, a being of pure will and power."
"Maybe," Harker said, his hand closing around the cold, reassuring metal of his gun.
But you're also bound to this house, to the rituals that brought you back.
He glanced at the open trunk, his mind racing, piecing together the fragments of knowledge he'd gleaned from his father's journals, from Professor Crane's warnings. You need a conduit, a vessel to fully cross over, he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke, and right now I'm standing in your way. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on his father, who watched him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain.
You're wrong, Lee.
His father rasped, taking a step towards him.
I don't need you. There are other ways, other sacrifices.
Harker shook his head, his eyes scanning the walls of the study, his gaze landing on the intricate sigils carved into the wooden paneling. No, father, he said, his voice firm, resolute. You need me. The bloodline must endure. Those were your words, weren't they? He reached out and touched one of the sigils, his fingers tracing the ancient symbols, feeling a surge of energy pulse beneath his fingertips. The air crackled, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet, a wave of coldness washing over him. He could feel his father's rage building, a palpable force that pressed down on him like a physical weight.
Don't touch that!
His father roared, his voice echoing through the house.
You don't know what you're doing?
Harker ignored him, his attention focused on the sigils, on the memories flooding back to him from his childhood, from his father's journals, from Professor Crane's frantic instructions over the phone just moments ago.
You can seal the door, Lee.
She had said, her voice urgent, strained.
But it requires a sacrifice, blood of the same line.
Harker closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He had hoped, even until this moment, that there might be another way, a way to save his father, to redeem him. But the creature standing before him, its eyes burning with a cold, inhuman light, was not his father. It was a monster wearing his father's face, a perversion of everything he had once held dear. He drew his gun and pointed it at the sigil, his finger tightening on the trigger. I'm sorry, father, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. This ends now. And then, with a cry of anguish and a heart filled with a grief he couldn't even begin to process, Harker pulled the trigger. The last chapter, The Shadow Within. The silence that descended upon the farmhouse was deafening. Harker stood amidst the ruins, the gun clutched in his hand, trembling with exhaustion. The sigils on the walls, once pulsing with energy, were now dark, their menace seemingly extinguished. The ritual was broken, or so it seemed. As he stumbled out of the farmhouse, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. He drove through the pre-dawn darkness, the city lights a distant promise of normalcy. But normalcy had long been a stranger to him. Back in his apartment, he poured a stiff drink, downing it in one go. He stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, his eyes shadowed and distant. Something inside him felt wrong, an unease deeper than guilt or grief, a sensation of something crawling beneath his skin. He opened his desk drawer to retrieve his journal, a trusted confidant over years of chasing monsters. As he flipped through its pages, he noticed something peculiar. The once blank margins were filled with writing, cryptic symbols and phrases that seemed familiar but alien. His own handwriting stared back at him, yet he had no memory of writing them. One line read, "The cycle must continue," scrawled in an unsteady hand. Below it, a single word sent a chill down his spine. Harker. Thanks for watching the video. Please consider subscribing. We release bone-chilling horror stories every week, guaranteed to haunt you long after the screen goes dark.